The first plant I want to show you this morning is one of my favorites, yellow root, Xanthorrhiza simplicissima. And one of its main roles in the forest is that it has really strong roots that keep the banks of the soil from eroding. So you often find it like it is here, just lining a creek or a river. This is Betty's Creek that we're sitting next to. Yellow root is something that grows in the Southern Appalachians and a little further north in the Appalachian Mountains, but not many other places. It's one of the first plants to sprout out in the spring, and it has this beautiful cascade of flowers that start out sort of a greenish brown color, and then they get more and more burgundy colored as the season progresses. You'll notice that it has a very unique growth characteristic. It has a very woody stem, and then at the point where the leaves emerge from the stem, the flowers also grow from that axil, and they sort of cascade down from the plant. So a lot of people don't even notice the flowers of this plant at first because they tend to be hidden under the foliage. And this is very early spring growth, so it's going to get a lot bigger, and these flowers are going to be less and less visible as you're walking along looking at plants. One of the things that makes this plant so easy to identify, besides its habitat, is the fact that when you scrape away some of the bark, so you can do this even before you harvest the plant to make sure that you've identified it correctly, you're going to see this really bright yellow layer underneath the outer bark. And there's also, I'm smelling the plant, and it has a really acrid, almost bitter fragrance. Yellow root has been used by the Cherokee and by people in the Southern Appalachians for centuries. Yellow root is a milder medicine, and it is more geared towards treating infections, bacterial infections. So we use it internally. There's been some research done on this plant, and it seems to have a really strong effect on H. pylori bacteria, the kind of bacteria that lodges in stomach ulcers and keeps people in a chronic state of ulcerations in their intestinal tract. It's also something we use externally, so I make skin preparations out of this, infusing it in oil and then making it into a skin salve. It can also be boiled or decocted and used as a mouthwash for things like thrush, sore throats, mouth ulcers, and then drunk as a tea. Now, one of the problems with this plant is that when I say that it's bitter, I'm underestimating its flavor. It's an extremely acrid, bitter tasting herb, but it's also very effective. Here in the South, you can still find people selling bundles of the root. And to be honest with you, the root, which I'm holding now, here you can see a little small plant with the root, doesn't look that much different from the stem. It's a very woody, dry root, and it also has that characteristic that when you scrape off the outer bark, you see the yellow inside. Usually what we're harvesting with this plant is from about where it emerges from the ground down. Because it grows along banks, it's sometimes tricky to harvest, but here I managed to get a pretty good long root, so that's what you'd be looking for. This plant, once it dries, it gets very, very hard. So we want to wash it. I would probably go down to the creek and give it a good rinse and then cut it into small pieces immediately. That's really true of most roots. When they dry, they become very hard. So the more processing you can do with them in the field, the better. This time of year when we're looking at the forest floor, we're going to see a lot of plants that aren't necessarily things that we would be harvesting because they're such small plants that it would be impossible to get enough to really do anything with. But when you start noticing some of these plants in the forest, you know that you're getting into a region where a lot of these medicinals are going to be found. This is a plant that I really like, and it's considered a spring ephemeral. It's called toothwort, and this is a cutleaf toothwort that I'm pointing to here. And its botanical name is Dentaria laccionata, and it has these really beautiful white flowers and this very cut trilobed leaf. And Dentaria is actually an edible plant. If you eat the flowers of this, it has the leaves of it have a very horseradish-like taste. So people do harvest them and add them to salads. The first woman who ever introduced me to Dentaria told me that her favorite thing to do with this plant was to collect the leaves and put it on a roast beef sandwich. So I've never really gathered any large amounts of it because there's not that much of it around. But I wanted to point it out to you because we're seeing it here, and this is something you would see in early April, late April in a cove forest in the Appalachian Mountains. Wow, I'm really excited to show you this next plant because this is something that I don't often get into the forest at the perfect time to see. This is a dwarf ginseng, and it has a lot of the characteristics of Panax quinquefolius, which is our medicinal American ginseng. It has a 5-lobed leaf, and then the flowers in sort of a circular formation. But you can see how tiny this plant is. There's a couple of them around here, and they're all in full bloom. Supposedly this plant would have the same, slightly milder medicinal properties as American ginseng, but obviously the roots are very small and they're not something that's used much at all. Notice also some of the other plants that are around this, so that if you ever want to look for this plant in the forest, here's a little bit of yellow root. We're not far from the bank of a stream and it's very damp here. There's a yellow root, and behind the yellow root there's a trillium just getting ready to bloom. There's its little flower bud there dangling below the leaves. We also see the leaves of a foam flower right here, and there's some more of the Dentaria toothwort in here that are a little harder to see because they're not in bloom, but the leaves are all here. So this is a little bit of a dwarf ginseng, and keep an eye out for that if you're ever in a forest that has some of these other plants.